So it wasn't the last comm of the day. I made a comm in my title, or pun. Wasn't the last pun of the day. Obviously, I made one in my title, but I'm actually not going to be talking about staying calm. I'll be focusing more on our research or the participatory dimensions of our research. But I represent a team of researchers out of Colorado State University. My co-authors are listed here, and I thank them very much for their input into this presentation. I'll be talking about our participatory approach to research. So we're not a management entity, but we are doing research in a collaborative way in 4 project areas, 3 in northwestern Colorado, and we also work in an area in Wyoming. So I'll be speaking to that. And throughout my presentation, I'm going to be bringing up a survey. In preparation for this presentation, I surveyed several of my co-authors as well as some of the land managers we work with to ask them questions kind of post for the call for proposals for this symposium. I asked them what benefits they saw to doing a collaborative approach, what challenges they saw, and one other question that I'll bring up at the very end. Our project focuses mainly on building state and transition models using a collaborative approach. Before I go on, I would expect many of you know what a state and transition model is. Show of hands, people who know. Great, high ratio. But in case you don't, I'm going to be referencing them. I'm not going to be talking about them in detail. I encourage you to look at the other resources available at this conference. But a state and transition model is basically a model that is a conceptual framework of how a particular type of land might change over time. So the different potential plant communities that could exist on a landscape. And we are engaged on our project on developing these. We're creating 4 to 5 throughout our project sites or contributing to state and transition models where they might already exist or where drafts might already exist. We're also integrating sage-grouse and songbird habitat, and we're adapting some outreach tools. But my talk today is basically going to be on the participatory elements of this process. Before I talk about what we do in a participatory sense or a collaborative sense, I want to define what a perhaps non-collaborative approach might look like. In a non-collaborative approach, this is oversimplified, but you might have researchers operating within a sphere. Researchers generate knowledge. Through outreach, we disseminate it. Land managers accept it and implement it, right? And hypothetically, this seems like it might work. It seems pretty logical. But we found, in the case of state and transition models and other research that some of you might be familiar with, it hasn't quite worked out this way. In surveys in 2009 and 2013 in Colorado and Wyoming, 350 ranchers were surveyed, and only about 4% of them used state and transition models in daily management. So that's a pretty low number. And in addition, this linear model, the arrows are going down. It kind of undervalues potential knowledge that land managers bring to research. Additionally, what happens if there's conflict? What happens if research that researchers produce conflicts with previously held beliefs that land managers have? Does that knowledge get applied? So these have been some critiques of that more linear approach to dissemination of knowledge. Our project experiments with one option or one way of integrating, a more participatory approach in integrating local knowledge and expert knowledge within state and transition model development. Basically, what we do is we ask people for their input early and often in this process. So we ask them at the beginning to help us identify priority ecological sites in the areas where we work. And we host a workshop, and I'm not going to talk about the workshop process in this presentation, but basically we used concept mapping to help stakeholders or guide stakeholders through a process where we identify questions and help them model the ecosystem dynamics. Through that process, we identify key questions to study, do observational studies, our team analyzes the data, and then we return to stakeholders. So this is a multi-year process. Right now we're funded for 3 years. We're in our 2nd year, and we're at various stages of going around this cycle in each of the project areas. But we come back to people midstream in our data collection. In some cases, state and transition models have already been built. So in those cases, we're doing adaptive management experiments or demonstrations. I'm going to now switch gears, perhaps, and give a couple of examples of different encounters we have had in project areas that I think illustrate some of the benefits and challenges of this approach we're taking to research. What you're looking at here is an area that was burned in 2010. It was formerly sagebrush steppe, no sagebrush now, and it's essentially a crested wheatgrass monoculture. Due to the stakeholder interest in the local area that we assessed in 2013, we decided to study areas that had been burned, people really interested in recovery after burn. And our understanding was this site had been burned in 2010 and then seeded. And when we went out and sampled in the field, we found several plots that were really dominated by this one species, crested wheatgrass, and they were outliers both in our ocular observations of the landscape when we were out there and in our data analysis. So when we came back to stakeholders in 2014, last year, we presented these outlier plots as they had been seeded following the burn with crested wheatgrass, because that was our assumption. And the rancher who owns this land came up to us and said he had actually never seeded crested wheatgrass. He had seeded a native bunchgrass mix. So we had been, of course, incorrect in our understanding of landscape history. And it was actually a really great moment, I thought, because by bringing the data, bringing back our preliminary results to stakeholders midstream, we were able to be corrected. We had a self-correcting mechanism in there in order to complete our understanding of landscape history, or at least start to complete it. So I think that's one of the benefits of this process, is that we have multiple entry points, stakeholders are involved throughout, so we can correct if we've not understood something. And sometimes you just don't think to ask the questions that might be necessary. This is an example of a project that we're working on in northwestern Colorado, further north, higher precipitation gradient, as maybe you can see. But this ranchers and other land managers in this area were really interested in weeds, and specifically seeding. So how effective seeding was in order to suppress white top growth after herbicide treatment. So working with that hypothesis, we were able to collaborate with some land managers, with Routt County Extension, as well as the Routt County Weed Supervisor. And they implemented the treatment. We did the experimental design and collected the monitoring data. So this demonstration project, it's pretty small scale, but it's an example of working together where it was very effective to come together, and we really wouldn't have been able to do this project without their skills, practical knowledge, and equipment. Furthermore, I think this is a good example of how we could potentially overcome conflicting ideas, because by working together, we've created a lot of buy-in from the beginning. So if the knowledge we produce conflicts with beliefs that people have had beforehand, then we might have a higher chance that they're not going to reject the knowledge that is generated. But there are some challenges in the CALM approach that we've been, the collaborative approach that we've been using. I'm going to tell a story of kind of, one could say, a failure that we've encountered. In 2013, I started this job. We started this iteration of the project, and one of the ranchers we work with is a very keen observer of the natural world. He is an excellent observer, and he really cares about sage-grouse habitat. He really cares about improving habitat for sage-grouse. And in the 90s, he'd applied some treatments to his land that he felt really did improve sage-grouse habitat. And he wanted us to look at his past treatments, and he also wanted to implement some new treatments. We took data in 2013 on areas that he had treated in the 90s, and then in the fall of 2013, he said he called me up, said he'd identified a site that he wanted to treat, but it wasn't a site that we'd already collected data on. So he asked me if he should go ahead and treat it, and through discussions with my team and other researchers, we ultimately said, please wait, because we hadn't collected data, so we would have had nothing to compare it to if he had treated that particular area, and also it was one replication. So from a scientific perspective, we couldn't really get on board because we didn't want to just have only one replication. So we asked him to wait. He did. He worked with us. He was able to engage other landowners who wanted to apply this treatment, so we would increase our replication, increase our spatial distribution across the landscape. Colorado Parks and Wildlife was interested in this, BLM was interested in it, so we got a lot of support in the community, and we sampled last summer, and then he's a rancher, and he had a lot of other obligations this fall and wasn't able to implement the treatment. So we probably won't have that as part of our project. But I think that this is really illustrative of some of the challenges that you might encounter. For example, ranchers and managers might have different needs. If you really, science, of course, we want to increase our replications, increase spatial distribution, and that's a big need for us. That may not always be what managers want or need or are capable of. Actually, that may not be something scientists are always capable of. But also, I think this illustrates that the process is very messy. There was a lot of back and forth in that interaction and a lot of communication that happened in order to try to get on the same page about what we could actually do. Also reaching out to new landowners. And I think it also illustrates sometimes things are going to fail. And I think that in all science things fail, but you add another variable when you add the human dimension. But overall, I think this actually was a really great learning process. And we're still working with that particular rancher. So take home, I think that putting the L in CAM, so putting landscape into CALM, requires commitment. It requires time. A common critique of projects like ours is that we're only a 3-year project, and so we're limited that way. If we had more time, and we are pursuing more funding to extend our project, we would be able to not only cultivate relationships, to work with more landowners, and increase the area we are able to sample, through building those human relationships and getting permission. But additionally, if something doesn't work out 1 year, you have a second chance built in or a third chance built in. So the final question I asked people, my co-authors and ranchers and managers, when I was preparing for this presentation, I asked them, poached from the symposium call for proposals, what have you learned about the relationship of science and management? And one thing that a lot of people brought up is that they learned that science and management are very interdependent. And this was both on the part of land managers and ranchers as well as scientists. The managers that we worked with said that they felt science was very important in order to understand the consequences of their decisions, and they really enjoyed the access to people in a real-time basis, so access to the institutions through direct contact with our team. And the researchers also saw a real value in working with land managers and learning from them. So I've redone the model I presented at the beginning to something that's more cyclical, where ranchers, researchers, and agency folks can learn from each other to co-create knowledge. And by doing that, I think we've illustrated or learned on our project that you can increase your understanding of ecosystem complexity and landscape history. You can also hypothetically overcome conflict by gaining buy-in into an inquiry process that everyone's a part of. And hypothetically, I think you can really increase implementation of knowledge. So one of the respondents to my survey wrote this. This process engages the curiosity of research and the practicality of field experience to develop imaginative techniques for solving real-world natural resource management challenges. So I think that's really the value of the approach we've taken, is that we take a step towards closing that gap between research and implementation. So that is the end of my presentation. But before I go, I would really like to thank all of my co-authors and acknowledge the students and staff on this project for their commitment and their flexibility in terms of making this project happen. Jennifer Timmer is not here today, but she's the PhD in wildlife on our project. And that is all. Thank you.